Proszę Państwa, bardzo serdecznie witam wszystkich Państwa właśnie w tej przepięknej auli Szkoły Głównej Handlowej. Widzę wiele osób, które były już w zeszłym roku na pierwszym inauguracyjnym wykładzie z serii Konarski Lectures. Wtedy wprowadzając do tego wykładu, na którym gościem specjalnym była profesor Luciana Duranti, powiedziałem, że właśnie bardzo by mi zależało na tym i mam nadzieję, że uda się to zrealizować, żeby to nie było jednorazowe wydarzenie. Wtedy, jak pamiętacie Państwo, zorganizowane dokładnie w 50. rocznicę śmierci profesora Kazimierza Konarskiego, również nazwane na cześć profesora właśnie po to, żeby o profesorze pamiętać i żeby jego imię było pamiętane, więc wydaje mi się, że to była słuszna idea i dzisiaj chyba obecność Państwa, tak liczna obecność na tej sali potwierdza, że pomysł z organizacją tego rodzaju wykładów był jak najbardziej słuszny, więc oczywiście ciężko jeszcze powiedzieć, czy drugi z serii wykładów możemy już powiedzieć, że to będzie na 100% kontynuacja, ale mam nadzieję, że właśnie tak będzie. Przypomnę też, bo widzę, oprócz tego, że widzę dużo osób, które były w zeszłym roku, to widzę też dużo nowych twarzy, co tym bardziej mnie cieszy i tym bardziej Państwa bardzo serdecznie na tym wykładzie witam. Więc przypomnę, że ideą organizacji tego cyklu, oprócz tego, co już powiedziałem, czyli oprócz upamiętnienia osoby profesora Kazimierza Konarskiego, było również to, żebyśmy, nazwałbym to, weszli w taką dyskusję naukową ze światem archiwalnym, zagranicznym, żebyśmy nie tylko mogli zaznajamiać się w trakcie tych wykładów z trendami obowiązującymi obecnie w nauce archiwistycznej, ale żebyśmy mogli się również wymieniać poglądami na ten temat i żebyśmy mogli się nie tylko uczyć, ale również, bym powiedział, adoptować dla nas te rozwiązania, które możemy uznać za potrzebne w naszej pracy, ale również, żebyśmy i my mogli dzielić się z tym światem zewnętrznym, zagranicznym, tym, co dzieje się w Polsce. Dlatego dzisiejszy wykład będzie już miał troszkę inną formułę jak ten pierwszy. Jak Państwo zauważyliście, w drugiej części po wykładzie zaraz oczywiście przedstawię naszego specjalnego gościa. Po tym wykładzie będzie krótka przerwa, a potem wrócimy i przewidziane jest około godziny na tę dyskusję. To oczywiście będzie zależało wszystko od Państwa, jak ta dyskusja będzie przebiegała, o czym będziemy rozmawiali. Natomiast nie ma już tej formuły zeszłorocznej, gdzie jakby ta dyskusja była trochę moderowana i ona była specjalnie zorganizowana po to, żebyśmy tak naprawdę przypomnieli osobę, jeszcze raz podkreślę, osobę profesora Konarskiego i ona była jemu poświęcona. Teraz myślę, że już pora na to, żebyśmy po prostu uczestnicząc aktywnie w wykładzie, potem dyskutowali na temat tego, co usłyszeliśmy i taka jest nasza propozycja na dzień dzisiejszy. Pozwolicie zatem, że przejdę do prezentacji naszego gościa specjalnego, tegorocznego. To jest pani doktor Laura Millar, która siedzi tutaj po mojej lewej stronie i pozwolicie Państwo, że parę słów o pani doktor powiem. A zatem tak, pani doktor Laura Millar przez prawie 40 lat pracowała jako konsultant i w zarządzaniu dokumentacją, i w zarządzaniu archiwami. Sama siebie nazywa jako niezależny naukowiec, pisarz, pedagog. Pracę magisterską obroniła na Uniwersytecie of British Columbia w Vancouver. To już myślę, że Państwu coś mówi. Wychodzi na to, że świat archiwalny bardzo mocno się w Vancouver skupia, bo nasz poprzedni gość, zeszłoroczny, pani profesor Luciana Duranti, również z Uniwersytetu British Columbia w Vancouver. Natomiast już pracę doktorską obroniła na University College of London i przez wiele lat pracowała również jako konsultant dla rządów, uniwersytetów, różnych instytucji religijnych, dla społeczności, jak dla archiwów społecznych i różnych innych przedsiębiorstw w wielu krajach na całym świecie, poczynając od Kanady, od Stanów Zjednoczonych, poprzez Hongkong, Bermudy, Trinidad i Tobago, Fidżi, Ghana. Możemy powiedzieć, że podróżuje dookoła świata, pomagając właśnie głównie w zarządzaniu dokumentacją. Ale to jest, proszę Państwa, część pracy naszego gościa specjalnego. Natomiast to, na co najbardziej chciałem Państwa uwagę zwrócić, myślę, że nie muszę tego wszystkiego oczywiście tutaj mówić. Państwo pewnie, mieli okazję również zapoznać się z biogramem, jak przybliżaliśmy, ale to jest warte podkreślenia. Te kilkadziesiąt publikacji z zakresu archiwistyki, w tym dwie rzeczy najważniejsze, czyli podręcznik, chyba najpopularniejszy w tym momencie podręcznik, wielokrotnie nagradzany podręcznik do archiwistyki, Archives, Principles and Practice. 2 wydania już do tej pory, w 2010 i w 2017 roku. No i kolejna, ja bym powiedział, naprawdę genialna rzecz pod tytułem A Matter of Facts, A Value of Evidence in an Information Age. I drugą rzecz, na którą chciałem zwrócić uwagę, to jest obecność i działalność pani doktor Laury w gremiach Międzynarodowej Rady Archiwów, w której jest zaangażowana od lat 80., jak dobrze pamiętam, od lat 80. Między innymi jest odpowiedzialna za taki bardzo interesujący program realizowany przez Międzynarodową Radę Archiwów dotyczący wprowadzania może nie tyle młodych osób, co nowych adeptów sztuki archiwalnej do zawodu. Tak jest zresztą zatytułowany, New Professionals. I jak mi się zdaje, chyba nikt z Polski do tej pory z tego programu nie skorzystał. Znaczy nie mam tej wiedzy, czy ktokolwiek się starał, żeby kiedyś z tego programu skorzystać, natomiast wydaje mi się, że mam dosyć dobrą wiedzę, i nie pamiętam, żeby ktokolwiek był uczestnikiem ostatecznie tego programu, więc zachęcam do tego. O to też pewnie będzie można panią dr Laurę zapytać ewentualnie w trakcie dyskusji, na czym ten program polega i nie wiem, co trzeba zrobić, żeby się do niego dostać. Bardzo ciekawa rzecz. Zachęcam do tego szczególnie młodych ludzi, których bardzo dużo na sali widzę i to mnie naprawdę zawsze ogromnie cieszy. No tak, to chyba tyle o pani doktor. Znowuż w jakimś tam skrócie, wiadomo, że wszystkiego w tak krótkim czasie nie opowiemy. Natomiast dzisiaj usłyszymy wykład dotyczący zarządzania bezkształtną masą w świecie wirtualnym. I chyba mogę powiedzieć, że tak, chyba jestem przekonany, że raczej chyba nikomu na tej sali to określenie użyte po raz pierwszy znowuż przez Konarskiego w 1927 roku nie jest obce. Tak? Chyba jesteśmy z nim dosyć dobrze zaznajomieni. Zresztą wydaje mi się, że genialne określenie i wtedy, ale i teraz. Tak? Bo to jest właśnie, to jest też świetna rzecz, która nam wyszła właśnie przy okazji tych wykładów, jak wiele z idei, które wtedy profesor Konarski zauważył, na które zwrócił uwagę, one tak naprawdę w dalszym ciągu są bardzo mocno aktualne i w zasadzie cały czas mamy, przynajmniej my jako archiwiści, mamy z nimi do czynienia. I ta bezkształtna masa, o której była mowa w latach 20. i 30. poprzedniego stulecia, w żaden cudowny sposób nam się nie rozpłynęła. Ona jest z nami do dzisiaj, ale tak naprawdę ona na naszych oczach trochę się przekształca. Przekształca się z tej formy papierowej, o której wtedy myślał Konarski, w to właśnie, co się dzieje w świecie elektronicznym. I wydaje mi się, że tak naprawdę to chyba to może się okazać nawet jeszcze większy problem dla nas niż wtedy dla archiwistów w latach 20. i 30. Poprzedniego stulecia, bo wtedy mimo wszystko, mimo tego, że masa była bezkształtna, to jednak była namacalna, była widzialna. Tak? Znaczy można było ją sobie doskonale wyobrazić, te sterty teczek w różnych miejscach umieszczonych, tak? Tworzących tę bezkształtną masę. Natomiast obecnie mamy sytuację taką, że ta masa bezkształtna w dalszym ciągu została z nami, tylko przeszła do tego świata wirtualnego, gdzie już dużo trudniej ją sobie wyobrazić i myślę, że również dużo trudniej może się okazać, będzie nią w tym świecie wirtualnym zarządzać. Ale nie mnie, to jakby inaczej, pozostawiam ten problem dla rozstrzygnięcia dla naszego gościa specjalnego. Ja miałem dosłownie przed 1,5 tygodniem okazję wysłuchać jednego z wykładów pani doktor właśnie na spotkaniu Międzynarodowej Rady Archiwów, więc jestem przekonany, że przed państwem naprawdę doskonała uczta, bym powiedział, godzinna. Zachęcam do uważnego słuchania. Zachęcam do tego, żebyście państwo po przerwie, którą planujemy po tym wykładzie, żebyście nie byli zmuszeni tak długo siedzieć w tych drewnianych ławach i skorzystali z poczęstunku, który będzie serwowany tam na zewnątrz, na górze tej sali, wrócili w komplecie i naprawdę żebyśmy mogli podyskutować o tym, co za chwilę usłyszymy. Proszę się nie obawiać, jak zwykle podkreślam to za każdym razem, proszę się nie obawiać, jeżeli ktoś nie zna angielskiego, były słuchawki, kto jeszcze nie wziął, to szybciutko trzeba wrócić i w nie się zaopatrzeć. Będzie można zadawać pytania po polsku, mamy tłumaczenie symultaniczne. Ważne jest to, żebyśmy dyskutowali, bo wtedy będzie tak naprawdę widać sens tego naszego spotkania i do tego jeszcze raz zachęcam. A teraz it is with great pleasure that I leave you in the hands of Dr. Laura Millar for the next 60 minutes, more or less. Dear Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you all. Dziękuję. I am honored to be here in Warsaw to speak to you today, to deliver this year's Konarski Lectures. The lectures are named for your outstanding Polish archivist Kazimierz Konarski, a founding father of modern archival science and the author of the first handbook for archivists in Europe. I stand in his shadow with humility and gratitude as I take this opportunity to share some thoughts with you. Let me start by clarifying my role. As Pavel said, I have been an independent records and archives consultant and scholar since I finished my master's degree in archival studies in 1984. Over close to 40 years, I have worked with agencies across Canada and internationally on the creation of sustainable archival programs, including for national governments, international aid agencies, the United Nations, the World Bank, and other organizations. I am not an official representative of any Canadian archival agency, federal, provincial, territorial, municipal, university, or other. I have seen the insides of dozens of archival institutions in my work, but I work independently, and my remarks today are entirely my own. And in typical Canadian fashion, I begin with an apology. My presentation is in English. I cannot speak to you in Polish, which makes me sad. The Polish language looks and sounds beautiful, but I hesitate to embarrass myself with my dreadful pronunciation. I beg your indulgence with my limitations, and I welcome your guidance so I can learn more than dzień dobry and Cinque. And now I also know puff for pheasant. Beautiful word. I also do not know enough about archival practice in Poland. One of the joys of encounters like this is an opportunity to learn more, and I am here to have you teach me as much as possible. What I have understood so far is this. Poland and Canada have much in common. We both have beautiful red and white flags. We both have about the same number of inhabitants. We both have complex and rich histories. But Poland's story is so different from Canada's. Poland today stands on the shoulders of centuries upon centuries of people living and working in the heart of Central Europe, farming and trading, establishing kingdoms and commonwealths and republics. Like a sheaf of wheat growing out of the ground, the archives that you have about Poland today came from the people and institutions of Poland across a rich and complex past. The First and Second World Wars brought chaos, upheaval, and destruction to Poland. Archives were one of the many victims of the horrors of war, and the work you have undertaken since to support reconstruction and to reconstitute and safeguard archival collections has been monumental. I understand your state archives network has existed since 1919, although the oldest archive has operated consistently for over 200 years. The State Archives of Poland is the primary government agency for archival management in the country. The integration of state-level archival services seems robust, and the work of the National Digital Archives, which I understand grew out of the archives of audiovisual records, has resulted in an exciting online resource. I also understand that other archival collections across the country tell the story of churches, universities, and local communities. I was delighted to hear about your Family Archives initiative during a presentation at the ICA Congress in Abu Dhabi 2 weeks ago. And I have been overwhelmed by the number of different digital resources providing access to archival documentation. Now, if I could just read Polish. As I discuss the situation in Canada, I remind you that we are a very large country with a very small population for our size. It would take over 100 hours to drive from the western to the eastern sides of Canada. I live in the very west coast of Canada, over 4,000 kilometers from our nation's capital in Ottawa. Canadians are active peacekeepers around the world, but we have not experienced war on our soil for centuries. We are a country that blends, usually successfully, Indigenous people with recent immigrants and with people like my family who have long and complex ties to the country. I am American-born of Canadian parents. My father is Canadian-born of American and English parents. My mother was Canadian-born of Irish parents. I have lived some of my life on different sides of the Canadian-American border. Dual or multiple citizenship is common for Canadians. We embrace our diversity as part of our identity. Let me outline my talk today, which draws on Kazimierz Konarski's idea of the shapeless mass of modern archives, as he wrote in his 1927 Archion article on issues of modern Polish archival science. The flood of physical and textual documentation that Dr. Konarski faced a century ago has become a torrent of invisible and elusive electronic records, photographs, audio recordings, databases, artificially intelligence-generated data, and more. These sources of evidence are stored in countless computer drives, cloud storage systems, and personal digital devices. How can the archivist manage digital sources that are both ephemeral and eternal at the same time? I will build on Dr. Konarski's concern about the shapeless mass. I have divided my remarks into 3 sections. First, I reflect on the nature of records and archives management in the 19th and 20th centuries in Canada. I believe Canada's archival history, like our socio-political history, has been quite different from yours in Poland, and I hope you will find this contextual information of interest and value. Second, I look at the impact of digital technologies on the content, form, and nature of records, archives, and evidence. I highlight the challenges archivists and records professionals face in our effort to protect sources of evidence in a digital age. Third, I present suggestions for action. How do we manage this shapeless mass of digital evidence? In this section, I will draw on some of the ideas I address in my book, A Matter of Facts, The Value of Evidence in an Information Age. So, to begin, let me offer an exceptionally brief historical overview of Canada to place our archival story in context. What is now Canada was home to Aboriginal people for millennia. Canada, as a distinct geopolitical entity, emerged as French and English missionaries and fur traders arrived in the 16th and 17th centuries. They were followed by refugees from the American Revolution, people loyal to the British Crown, people like my ancestors, who were expelled from the new United States in the late 1700s. Many were given grants of land in the British colonies of Canada. My ancestors were shipbuilders from the maritime provinces in eastern Canada. Canada became a commonwealth under the British Crown in 1867. As more immigrants came to Canada from Europe, Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, the population grew more diverse. Today, Canada's population of 40 million people represents over 250 different ethnic origins. The largest diaspora communities in Canada are Chinese, with 1.7 million people, Italian, with 1.6 million people, Indian, with 1.3 million people, and Ukrainian, with 1.4 million people. Diversity is the heart of our identity. In 1871, the Government of Canada established a new archival agency, the Dominion Archives, to collect and preserve the documentary memory of the country. This is only 4 years after the country itself was formed. The first archivist, Douglas Brimner, who served from 1871 to 1901, was a journalist. Administratively, the archival agency was placed within the office of the Minister of Agriculture. It's not a typical start to archival development. And Brimner was not allowed any access to Canadian government records that were still in use. All the documentation under government control was off limits to him. His remit was to collect the old stuff, stare in Polish. As he said, he was given the title of archivist along with 3 empty rooms and very vague instructions. To help him with his work, Brimner looked for guidance about what archives were and where they could be found. He looked for definitions and theories to frame his work. This was all before the time of Dr. Konarski in Poland, before Hilary Jenkinson in England, before Theodor Schellenberg in the United States. Brimner turned to the now famous Dutch manual by the authors Müller, Faith, and Freund. And over time, he and his staff members traveled to the United Kingdom and France to learn from archivists there. What he learned was that most of his colleagues defined archives as the documentary evidence of actions, transactions, communications, decisions, and ideas. Government decrees, financial ledgers, and correspondence, physical, tangible sources of information and evidence. The custodial repositories he studied held documents that had been created in the past and kept for reference and research. This concept of archives, articulated in European manuals and in English and French practice, was steeped in Roman law, Greco-Roman record-keeping traditions, and Western approaches to records and archives. This, of course, is the definition we generally accept in the archival world today. It underpins the guidance provided by organizations such as the International Council on Archives and by national archival organizations. As you will see, I think there are problems with this definition. Bremner had problems with this definition too, but in very different ways. But let's imagine Bremner sitting in his empty rooms looking for the documentary evidence of Canada. Even though, as I have mentioned, the country had been occupied by Indigenous people for millennia, they didn't produce records as defined by the likes of Miller, Faith, and Freund. And the records that did fit that definition, the paper records of missionaries, traders, settlers, and colonial officials, those had all been transported back to England and Europe when the colonial representatives, the military officers, and others went back home. Many of the people still living and working in Canada hadn't yet produced any records old enough to fit the concept of archives. So what is an archivist to do? How can you preserve original documents if you don't have access to original documents? Bremner met this challenge by collecting private documents from settlers and military officials, and he filled in the gaps with an active, and I would say extreme, copying program. He hired staff to live in France and England for months or years, copying records and personal papers held in storage vaults in national and regional repositories. By the mid-1880s, Bremner's staff of copyists had transcribed thousands and thousands of pages of original documents. This copying program was so robust that our National Archival Repository still had staff in Europe actively copying when I began my archival career 40 years ago. But what about provenance, original order, custodial history, or the idea of a phone? Those matters were not of much interest to Bremner. His goal was to collect anything that would help tell the story of Canadian history. Content was much more important than context. This all-encompassing definition of archives was embraced by Bremner's successor, Arthur Doughty, who served as Dominion archivist from 1904 to 1935. By the time Arthur Doughty took on the role of Dominion archivist, Hilary Jenkinson had written his manual in England, and Dr. Konarski was actively leading archival work in Poland. The idea that archives were defined by their content, context, and structure, that concepts of provenance and original order and the phone were central to archival management, these were central ideas in Europe. As Dr. Konarski argued, the uniqueness of the different items in a body of archives, the different documents or photographs or ledgers, was intricately connected to their placement within an aggregation of materials. The aggregation, the collection of archival materials in their original order, became known as the phone. Dr. Konarski explained this in his article from 1927, and I appreciate that I am reading an English translation of his words in Polish. which I think is ironic and inadequate, but I beg your indulgence. He said, "Records pass through all departments of the office. They cross paths many times and merge and fuse with each other. These threads, crossing in all directions, create a closed, consistent, organic whole. This whole we will call an archival phone." To provide this physical, time and place-based service, archivists brought these aggregations of archival materials into a custodial environment, a storage repository, and then the archivist arranged, appraised, described the materials. The phone was central to archival work, wasn't it? Not to Arthur Doughty. As he wrote in a public report, "It is immaterial to the inquirer whether a letter of a governor had been found in a particular collection in Europe or in Canada." The practice started by Brimner and continued by Doughty soon became a defining principle of Canadian archival work. Anything that helped explain Canadian history could be considered archival. I must add, having read some of Arthur Doughty's personal correspondence myself, I think he was more than a collector. He was a hoarder. Zbieracz in Polish? Canada's National Archives was, he believed, his creation. The collections were his to shape and define. And he collected everything, from documents to paintings to clothing to military equipment. So one of the pillars of Canadian archival theory was not the concept of the phone, it was the idea of totality. Another key pillar in Canada was the central role of government. This vision was embraced by the archival community and by the population at large. Let me explain the origins of that idea. Canada's closest neighbor has always been the United States. We are neighbors, and we are friends. We have fought wars against each other, and we have fought wars alongside each other. We are often referred to as children of a common mother, but we suffer from a lot of sibling rivalry. From the creation of the American colonies in the 1600s, Americans have always believed in the separation of church, state, and citizen. Their national identity is built on the idea of limited government. After all, they created their country to kick out George III, King of England. Canadians define ourselves by staying in the good books of that same king and his descendants. We are a sovereign nation, but we are a part of the British monarchy. King Charles III is our king, and most Canadians really don't mind. Canadians tend to have a benevolent opinion of our government, or of our governments, because we have many: federal, provincial, regional, municipal, and First Nations. We complain about government, but mostly, I think, because we think our public sector should be doing more, not less. In the archival realm, government was seen as directly responsible for the preservation of archives, and those archives were defined broadly as coming from all sources, public and private, copies or originals, textual, visual, or oral. Distinctions based on medium or form or purpose were much less important than the idea that historical materials were kept and that the government should be responsible for this work. So you have Douglas Brimner, responsible for archives, but not having any archives in custody. He had to go find some. You have Arthur Doughty believing that anything that crossed his threshold should be kept in the archives. And you have a population that sees the government as a central figure in our cultural lives. This broad archival vision was entrenched in the 1970s. Celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Dominion Archives of Canada, the Dominion archivist Wilfred Smith argued that public archival institutions should be responsible not only for the reception of government records, which have historical value, but also for the collection of historical material of all kinds and from any source which can help in a significant way to reveal the truth about every aspect of Canadian life. As you can imagine, sustaining a total archives program of archival management is not easy for any government. Money doesn't grow on trees, as we say in English. Collecting private archives means diverting resources from the care of government records. How can a total archives repository serve two masters, the government official and the research public? Also, in a country as large as Canada, serving a population across thousands of kilometers was a struggle. Over time, Canadians realized that having one archives in Ottawa was not terribly logical. Provinces and territories established their own archival institutions, and then universities and colleges, churches and municipalities, community groups, and historical associations. In 1871, there was one national archival institution and a handful of local collections. By the 1970s, there were about 50 archival institutions across the country. By the 1980s, there were about 200. Today, there are over 1,000 archival institutions across Canada of various sizes and shapes. Many of these institutions adhere to this total archives philosophy. They acquire and manage their institutions' official records, and they also collect and preserve non-institutional documentary evidence in all media, in all forms. Archivists came up for a term with this distributed approach, with archival institutions scattered all across the country, many funded directly by the governments. We called it the Canadian Archival System. As part of this system, the federal government provided and still provides funding for a range of archival work. At the moment, the government contributes about $1.5 million a year to help archival institutions clean up backlogs of unprocessed archives, to arrange and describe archives, and to build online descriptive tools. The government also funded the creation of our National Descriptive Standard, Rules for Archival Description, a precursor to the ISAD-G International Standard for Archives. The funds have also been used to establish an archival advisory program, which allowed provinces and territories to hire full or part-time archival advisors who provide education and training, conduct site visits, and provide advice for archival institutions in the region in which they are based. The success of these initiatives has varied, and the funding is meager. $1.5 million does not go very far across 1,000 institutions. It is also worth noting that in 2004, Canada's National Archives and National Library merged into one agency, Library and Archives Canada. This blended National Library and National Archives became the home of government archives, private archival collections, publications, maps and plans, documentary art, photographs, stamps, and seals. So here we are in 2023. We have one blended National Archives and National Library, 10 provincial and 3 territorial archival agencies, and hundreds of municipal and regional archival operations. We have university and college archives, art gallery archives, church archives, and special interest archives. We have an increasing number of First Nations archives, as many indigenous groups have established legal claims to land and taken on responsibilities for economic and social development in their communities, which means they are creating physical and digital documents that need to be protected. The list of archival institutions is just about endless. Canadian archivists are generally rather proud of the history that led to this total archive system. We value the role of government in archival development, and we recognize that the story of society cannot be told only from government records. Private archives and material in all media and forms help to document our history, national, regional, or local. But the truth is, without public funding, this comprehensive approach to archival service could easily collapse. I have been a critic of this approach, which I fear is increasingly unsustainable. Next, we turn to the challenge of the digital, which is, I believe, putting extraordinary pressure on archival services around the world, including in Canada. So we arrive at last to the 21st century reality of Kazimierz Konarski's Shapeless Mass. Computerization has fundamentally changed the nature of work, life, and archives, from Canada to Poland, from South Africa to China. Archival institutions around the world are struggling with the challenge of acquiring and preserving digital documentation. The impact of digital technologies is international, but I believe every society has to consider its own historical and cultural realities when deciding how to act. I began my remarks today with an overview of the social and cultural realities of archival work in Canada because I think that cultural context is so very important. Archival work in Canada is difficult in part because we have built our philosophy of archives on a custodial model and on a broad and vague definition of archives. There is more focus on collecting old materials and less on managing new evidence from the start. With our custodial focus, records management and archives in Canada, and also in the United States, are defined as very different areas of work. We have different professional associations and different interpretations of our professional roles and responsibilities. I am often rebuffed when I argue for a closer continuum of care between current records and historical archives. But in a digital world, we will not have good archives at the end if we don't have records and evidence from the start. It is not that I don't care about culture and heritage. I began my career in archives because of my deep interest in the value of history and culture. But selling culture, heritage, and history is hard, especially to governments with extensive public responsibility and limited resources. Today, virtually all of society's records start life in digital form. Where would we have been during the COVID-19 pandemic if we didn't have Zoom to keep us connected? How would scientists have developed Nobel Prize-winning mRNA technologies without computers? How would we keep airplanes in the sky and ships crossing the sea without digital resources? The digital products of these communications and interactions, the materials we archivists want to manage and preserve for posterity. They are born, they live, and often they die in the hands of their creators before they ever make it into any kind of archival environment. How can our archives reflect this shapeless mask? Dr. Konarski saw it coming, didn't he? As he wrote in 1927, 20th century archival science is in peril. Modern bureaucracy has rapidly undergone qualitative and quantitative changes. Gone will be the manuscripts, along with their meaning, when machine prints replace them. Much of the semi-official business will be absorbed by the phone. The veritable geological layers of paper will flood the archives with its shapeless mass. The tragic deliverance from this flood would be perhaps the fact that current records will disintegrate into ash long before they reach the archives. The traditional archival institution in Canada might not receive archives for 10 or 20 or 100 years after the records had been created. If we don't take action from the start, current records will disintegrate into ash or digital dust before they make their way into our care. I wonder what poor Dr. Konarski would think if he were with us today. According to the statistical website Statista, people send and receive close to 350 billion emails around the world every day. Over 33 million Canadians own a cell phone. That's over 90% of our population. Statisticians are now counting the annual growth in data created and shared in zettabytes. I don't even know what a zettabyte is. What does this dramatic growth in information technologies mean for our efforts as keepers of archives, of the small sliver of documentary memory worth keeping? Computers shatter traditional assumptions, don't they? Here's my view of the impact of digital technologies on archival practice. Archivists cannot wait for documentary evidence to become old before we act. We cannot wait for digital records to be created, stored, used, appraised, then preserved in order to capture the core evidence needed for posterity. How can we extract the small portion of valuable emails from the 350 billion emails sent each day if we wait for a decade? We will only be able to keep documentation if we play a role from the beginning. Acquisition, arrangement, description, contextualization, and access are all based on the idea that archives can be defined as phone. Every methodology we use today starts from the assumption that some whole body of archives will come to us with some measure of provenance and original order as a defining feature. Consider this. Much of the evidence essential to charging and convicting people in the United States who attacked the American Capitol in 2021, much of that evidence was not created by the American federal government. A great deal of the valuable documentation was posted on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, now X, by people who were there as rioters or as bystanders. Are we going to wait to acquire the whole body of archives, the phone of Joe or Jane or Fred who witnessed the events in person, when they decide to donate their archives to a repository 20 or 30 years from now? Are we going to collect what evidence we can from social media sources? And why are we collecting that evidence? For history or to uphold justice and the rule of law? Provenance, original order, and the phone are all contextual elements in archives. But modern evidence comes with complex, multiple provenances, with no linear original order as we understand it, and not necessarily as part of a cohesive aggregation. If we wait for the whole to exist before we participate in its care, we will end up deferring essential record-keeping work until it is too late. Evidence intersects governments, organizations, and people. In a digital world, the evidence of us is not necessarily made by human hands. How do we deal, for example, with closed-circuit television footage. CCTV cameras are everywhere, and the images they capture are used as evidence in law. Are they also evidence for archival and societal purposes? If so, how do we capture them? What do we capture? How do we preserve it? What about generative artificial intelligence? The evidence created using technologies such as ChatGPT or Google Bard is evidence of something, isn't it? What is the archival role in capturing and protecting such materials? How do we shape our policies, procedures, and methodologies to accommodate these digital realities? The future is here, and we must deal with it. But how? In my country, in Canada, as I said, the foundation of archival practice has been built on public service, on public funding, and on the assumption that custodial care will be the norm. Our archival system is what scientists call a closed ecosystem, a closed loop. Look at it again. Where is the public? Where is the creator of records or the user of archives? They are not part of the scheme. How is an ecosystem sustainable if it does not invite new sources of energy? People need oxygen to breathe. Archives management needs records creators and records users to sustain our archival life. Digital technologies shatter the assumption that the public sector can and should be a primary funder of archival work. The organizations that create sources of evidence must be encouraged, if not required, to take responsibility for protecting those sources of evidence, not just for narrow legal reasons, but because our world is richer and more accountable when all sectors of society recognize the value of facts, truth, and evidence. The foundation of archival practice in Canada also relies on archivists, a poorly recognized and poorly respected class of worker. We are underpaid and overworked, yet we carry on with the zeal of a missionary. But as my dear Canadian friend and colleague Richard Volpe argued in a seminal 2016 article in the Canadian journal Archivaria, archivists are not missionaries. As he wrote, and I quote, "Archival professionals can advise society on the how of archival management, and archival institutions can provide the support system for housing, protecting, and making available those archives that come into their custody. But neither professionals nor institutions can make society create and keep good records. We cannot make the horse drink." I don't know if you have this expression in English. We say in Polish, we say in English, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Archivists cannot save archives if the creators of records and society at large don't want those archives to exist. We cannot make the horse drink. If we do not find a new approach to the archival endeavor, then Dr. Konarski's ashes will indeed turn to digital dust. Now, after 40 years, much of my work now is advocacy. I think one of the most important things we can do in the archival community is to engage with the public, to raise awareness of the critical importance of evidence as a source of facts and truth. This awareness raising will help us achieve other critical results too. I believe that strategic action is needed in 4 areas. The first relates to the legal and regulatory environment in which records and other sources of evidence and information are created and managed. The second relates to the design of information technologies. The third relates to the critical task of raising public awareness of the value of records, archives, and other sources of evidence. The fourth relates to our role as archivists in society. First, our governments need to strengthen the legal and regulatory framework in which records, archives, and other sources of evidence are created, used, and managed. Societies need strong, sustainable, enforceable records and information legislation and regulations. I understand Polish requirements for records classification are quite strong, and I congratulate you. But we also need stricter controls around the design, development, and implementation of digital technologies. The European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, is a valuable tool. But GDPR and similar legislative mechanisms need to include formal recognition of the enduring value of evidence. It's not just data. It's not just information. It can stand as proof. Sebastian van der Laars, founder and chief executive officer of the Trusted Web Foundation, has argued that strengthening data and information legislation is necessary to support integrity and authenticity. As he said, and I quote, "Consumers should demand transparency and accountability. If information impacts your life, as a citizen, you deserve the freedom to verify how information changed over time and who the sender is." As van der Laars has argued, and I agree, integrity of evidence must be a precondition of records creation, not an afterthought. Second, those who design and distribute and use information technologies need to incorporate stronger record-making and evidence protection protocols into their systems. If we are going to have evidence for present and future use, we need to build evidence by design into computer systems. Archivists also need to insert our expertise into the development of technologies for making and keeping information and records. As I have said many times, we cannot wait to acquire old archives so that we can then examine their provenance and determine if they are authentic. We can and should continue to contribute to the development of tools to capture and preserve authentic digital signatures, to blockchain or similar technologies for record keeping, and to the work of coding software and firmware to authenticate sources of information. Andy Parsons, Senior Director of the Content Authenticity Initiative at the computer software company Adobe, has taken steps by developing technical standards for certifying the source and history of media content. Under the oversight of a body called the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, or C2PA, Adobe is developing content authenticity tools that sit within hardware and software. For example, coding is being built into the software that operates digital cameras so that GPS, tracking, and descriptive data are captured the moment an image is created. The software then ensures this metadata persists when the images are exported into other repositories, from digital storage systems to news feeds. Automation can help us here, replacing the sometimes erratic capture of metadata by humans, which require that the creator or holder of information must remember to add the contextual data. Automation can allow a more consistent method of contextualizing evidence, because authenticity needs to be guaranteed from the beginning. The third action, the public needs to understand why records, archives, and other sources of evidence matter. We archivists cannot make this change in public perception by ourselves. We must reach out and build bridges across disciplines and across sectors of society. We must engage more widely with others in the information community. Archivists need to be advocates. The more we engage with the public about the value of archives, the more we will gain their support. But we need to change how we communicate. If we focus on the past, on the old, people will not understand their role in the digital archives of today. We need to emphasize evidence and authenticity. We need to explain how documentary evidence serves as an antidote to fake news. We need to speak a bit less about research and scholarship and a bit more about rights, responsibilities, identity, and memory. This shift in language does not change who we are, but as the materials we work with change, and as our processes change, our relationship with the public also needs to change. Fourth, archivists need to re-examine our role and duties in society. What is our professional identity? We can no longer think of ourselves as custodians only or custodians first. Sometimes we need to be advisors. Sometimes we need to be activists. We need to expand the understanding of what it means to be an archivist. We must not look at our role in professional isolation, but as part of a wider vision to support the recognition of facts and truth and evidence as antidotes to lies and disinformation. Taking a strategic approach is essential. Our professional associations have a role to play in clarifying or redefining the archival role and in implementing stronger, more enforceable, and more relevant organizational and ethical frameworks for our work. In my presentation to the International Council on Archives in Abu Dhabi this month, I called on the ICA to completely overhaul our international professional codes of ethics to reflect the changes in archival responsibilities in the digital age. I have called on national and regional archival associations to do the same, and I wait in hope. I want the public to understand the value of all types of documentary evidence, digital and analog, public and private, creative and corporate. But archives are not just about risk and bureaucracy. Archives are about stories, memories, and connections. And archives as defined in Western law are not the only way that societies remember. When I began my story of the development of archives in Canada today, I told you about our very Western document-focused approach to evidence. The voices of Indigenous people were silent in this approach, as were the voices of immigrants and others whose cultures and identities are not shaped through the creation of physical sources of proof. Canadian archivists are starting to see that our foundation for archival practice, based on the idea that evidence is static, physical, and documentary, leaves out whole sections of our national story. For example, a wampum belt is a form of evidence in an Indigenous context. Such a textile production was often created to mark an agreement between different communities. It's a treaty. But the context in which the wampum belt is understood is not documentary. The belt alone does not tell the story. It is traditionally cared for by a member of the Indigenous community in question. That person interprets the belt, providing the contextual information, the metadata, as it were. That information resides in the memory of the keeper and is formally passed down from one generation to the next. But putting a human keeper in an acid-free box isn't possible, is it? Describing that keeper's memory according to rules for archival description is problematic. But that belt and that keeper form part of the memory of that community. This different type of memory should be acknowledged, even if, or especially if, its care involves very different protocols from those we typically apply in archives. I recently had the opportunity to facilitate a virtual symposium held under the auspices of the Canadian Advisory Committee for Memory of the World and financed by the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, with additional funding from the International Council on Archives, from Heritage Saskatchewan, and Western University in Canada. The symposium brought together a dozen experts and an audience of over 200 from around the world. Meeting over Zoom, we spent a day considering the relationships between records, archives, and other forms of cultural expression, from oral traditions, songs, and folklore, to crafts and living heritage. One of the lessons I learned from this experience was that archivists must keep redefining the concept of evidence to meet the dynamic realities of technology and society. But we must also acknowledge that physical or digital documentary evidence is only one form of cultural expression. Some other expressions hold evidence too. Others don't hold so much evidence. But we should acknowledge their existence and determine how to protect them within our societies. Let me end my presentation with an articulation of my own vision for the future of records, archives, and evidence. I want to support the existence of evidence, documentary and otherwise, as a foundation for societies that are enlightened, democratic, respectful, and self-aware. I want to ensure archives play a central role in holding institutions and agencies, both public and private, accountable for their actions, so they are transparent, effective, and democratic. I want people to be able to draw on records, archives, and evidence as a means for forming a sense of personal and collective identity, for sharing memories, and for building a sense of belonging. I want to see records and archives as a lever for helping people work together for the common good while respecting each other's autonomy and agency. To achieve that vision for the future, my efforts now are on raising awareness of the importance of a collective consciousness which comes with a shared understanding of truth and facts and evidence. This doesn't mean one and only one truth, but it does require a recognition of the value of fact-based truth, which depends on access to sources of evidence, including but not only documentary materials such as data, records, and archives. I also believe in the power of artifacts and stories, art and music, and other types of tangible and intangible heritage. But my specialty is documentary evidence, and I don't pretend to those other areas of knowledge, though I recognize their value and I support their protection. My vision speaks of diversity and inclusion, which are a defining feature of Canadian culture. As a recent advertising campaign for our national broadcaster says, it's not how Canadian you are, it's who you are in Canada. But I believe that archivists around the world share the same vision. We want the public to value evidence. We want decision makers to strengthen legislation and regulations around the creation and the management of information and evidence. We want improved digital technologies that protect the evidential content of digital materials. We want the world to recognize that we are ethical, trustworthy professionals dedicated to the public good and helping to make change through our area of expertise. There will always be a role for the archivist. Some of us will still be custodians, working in archival repositories. Others will focus less on what is in front of us and more on how we liaise with our partners in the wider ecosystem. We may be strategic planners, teachers, and advisors. We may be more activist than archivist. I still see us as evidence specialists, managing sources of documentary proof in different ways, in different contexts. I am so enjoying my time here in Poland, and I thank you for letting me share my ideas with you today. I hope to learn from you about your vision for the future of archives and evidence management in your country and beyond. Let me end on a hopeful note. Kazimierz Konarski saw a shapeless mass. I see a tangled pile of electronic wires, but perhaps we are both looking at something that can be crafted into a beautiful product. Working together, we can make it. Thank you. Dziękuję.